In Philadelphia, a woman's car was found abandoned on the side of a busy highway, still running, but the driver was missing. At the scene, police found several clues. But was there enough forensic evidence to solve the mystery? Route 476 is one of several highways that links Philadelphia to the suburbs. Hundreds of thousands of commuters travel that road every day. On June 20th, 1996, at 2 o'clock in the morning, an off-duty ambulance crew spotted an abandoned car along an exit ramp of 476. The engine was running, the lights were on, the radio was blaring, the driver's door was open, but no one was inside.
There was a tire iron found in front of the car. I found some blood in front of the car. I found a stone with blood on it in front of the car. And on the guardrail, there appeared to be some blood splatter next to the car.
We later had an interpretation done of the blood pattern in front of the car, and we learned that it appeared as though someone had been laying on the ground for a brief time in front of the car.
The crime scene says that this person was violently attacked in a very fast mode, meaning that they were hit very quickly as far as the violence was concerned, and then they were extricated from that site very quickly. This person didn't stay around long.
Next to the car was a tire impression, which was photographed for analysis. A forensic expert then made a cast of the impression, which was sent to the state crime lab. The automobile was registered to Gail Willard, but had been driven that night by her daughter, 22-year-old Amy Willard, a star soccer and lacrosse player at George Mason University in Virginia. Amy was spending the summer at home with her family, who lived just a few miles from where the car was discovered. Amy told her mother she was going to Smokey Joe's bar. And her friend said Amy left the bar alone at 1:30 in the morning.
She had never been to Smokey Joe's before. When she came home, she very rarely went out and met people because of the fact the time constraints on when she was home. When she was home, she kind of stayed around here and we hung out together and things like that.
Damage to the vehicle led police to think that Amy may have been the victim of a carjacking.
There was an abrasion on the back bumper that was not there when Amy drove off in the car. I noticed it because it was my car and I knew everything about my car. And I had pointed it out to the police.
Possibly at that traffic light, right where she's going to turn off the 476 off-ramp onto the Route 1 on-ramp, there's a traffic light right there. I believe that that's where he would have bumped her car. She immediately pulls over onto the ramp, gets out of her car to exchange information.
The next morning, about a half mile from where Amy's car was abandoned, police found a pair of panties and sneakers.
They brought them down for me to identify them, and they definitely were her sneakers and panties. They definitely were.
The panties weren't soiled with dirt. They weren't wet, they were dry, as were the shoes. It appeared to me as though those items had been brought back after the rain, which would have meant that they were brought back after her car was found.
An indication the abductor had returned to the scene of the crime to dispose of the items. Detectives screened video surveillance tapes from stores and bank ATMs near Smokey Joe's bar, but Amy had not stopped at any of these locations. Then, an unexpected lead fell right into investigators' laps.
Amy Willard's car was found abandoned on a Blue Route off-ramp in Marble Township.
After Amy Willard disappeared, police appealed to the community, asking anyone with information to come forward. One of those who responded was 23-year-old Andrew Kobach, who said he had been driving on Route 476 on the night Amy disappeared and saw something suspicious in the vicinity of Amy's car. Police knew Kobach. Years earlier, he had been accused of impersonating a police officer. Police say Kobach would turn a siren on, instruct the driver to pull over, and then show the driver a badge. A motorist turned him in, but he was never charged.
Stop sign back there, right through it.
Kobach immediately became a suspect, since investigators now thought he might have done the same thing with Amy Willard.
By virtue of placing himself back at the scene, it was consistent with what is oftentimes a characteristic of people who commit crimes that are being investigated is out of curiosity or some other kind of motivation. They return to the vicinity of the crime, in essence, to get a feel for what's going on.
Less than 24 hours after Amy Willard disappeared, children playing in a deserted lot in North Philadelphia discovered the nude body of a woman.
I sniffed and I smelled something, and then I saw it and I ran.
There was a Nike logo tattooed on her ankle, which Amy's parents identified.
That was the hardest day of the whole thing, not knowing where she was. There was more of a relief when they found her body in Philadelphia, that I had her back, that we could find out, help to find out what happened to her. No one could bring her back to life, but at least I had her.
An autopsy revealed that the 5'2", 120-pound woman died from multiple blunt force injuries to her head and face. The medical examiner estimated she died at 7 o'clock in the morning, about 5 hours after she was abducted.
This is a crime of momentary passion or a crime of between two people that know each other, but somebody that actually hunted down, stalked somebody, committed the murder, the crime, and then went to another location to try to deposit the evidence and throw the authorities off the trail.
The examiner determined that Amy had been sexually assaulted. DNA evidence from the rape test kit was sent to the forensics lab for testing.
We had essentially the genetic fingerprint of our murderer, and we just needed to identify that person.
The coroner also described an unusual pattern on Amy's upper body, but police weren't sure what caused the mark. Meanwhile, forensic experts completed their analysis of the tire impressions found at the crime scene. They were from a Firestone 440 13-inch tire, often found on small compact cars. Andrew Kobach's automobile did not have those tires, and a search of his home turned up nothing. Kobach was officially eliminated as a suspect when his DNA profile did not match the semen from the rape test kit. With no other leads, the killer's trail turned cold. Then, 1 year after Amy Willard's death, 19-year-old Patty Jordan reported an attempted carjacking to police. She said it was a man who had followed her after she left a local nightclub.
And at the next light, that car must have made the light, and I didn't, and that's where he hit my car. I just went, and he motioned for me to pull over, and I was like, you hit my car, and he was just like, pull over, and it turned green, and I just kept on going, and my headlights shone on his license plate, and that's how I got his license plate.
Fortunately, Patty had memorized the license plate number. The vehicle was registered to 38-year-old Arthur Bomar. 20 years earlier, in 1978, Bomar had been convicted of second-degree murder in Nevada and was sentenced to life in prison. Unbelievably, he was released on parole after serving only 11 years.
Where the mentality was in all that by the parole board in the state he came from, I really don't know. Let me tell you something, there are people that cannot be reformed, and no matter what you do, they will not change. And Arthur Bomar is one of those people.
Bomar had a 20-year history of problems with the law, including several assaults on young women.
This is a guy who really hates women and despises them and wants to punish them and wants to feel virile and feels that he deserves this. This is his way of getting back.
Investigators learned that the day Amy Willard disappeared, Philadelphia police pulled Bomar over for questioning on an unrelated matter.
He had been stopped roughly 6 blocks away from the scene where her body was found. So he was someone that we certainly wanted to talk to and we were attempting to locate.
Police went to interview Bomar about the Amy Willard case, but they couldn't find him. So the search was on. A year after Amy Willard's murder, there had been another attempted carjacking in Philadelphia. Information provided by the victim identified the culprit as an ex-convict, Arthur Bomar, but police couldn't find him. Not long afterwards, another woman called police to report a man trying to break into her third-floor apartment. The man was arrested and identified himself as Peter Thomas Love. In his pocket was a set of car keys to a Honda automobile.
They determined that there was a Honda nearby. They ran that tag, and they learned that that tag belonged to Arthur Bomar, assigned to a 1993 Ford Escort owned by Arthur Bomar.
Police also discovered that Peter Thomas Love was an alias. He was, in fact, Arthur Bomar. But why was Bomar's license plate on a Honda and not on his 1993 Ford Escort? The answer was simple. The car was stolen. It belonged to Maria Cobuenos, a 25-year-old woman who had been missing for 3 months.
Maria Cobuenos was a young woman who lived in the city of Philadelphia who was reported missing by her family. She was supposed to appear at work one morning and failed to appear.
Investigators believe that Cobuenos was abducted while driving on Route 476, the same highway where Amy Willard had been attacked. Dried blood was found in the trunk on Maria's car, which Bomar was driving. Both bumpers were slightly scraped, like Amy Willard's car. Bomar immediately became a suspect in Maria's disappearance. Now more than ever, police believed he might have been involved in Amy Willard's murder.
Come to the prison. I'll tell you all what you want to know, but I don't think it's fair to put me on TV and I'm not being charged with anything.
His alibi was that he was present at a birthday party and not outside the bar that Amy was that evening. He had been with a family. It was not a family, it was a young woman that he was seeing. This woman had a child.
But Bomar's fiancée contradicted that. She said Bomar was at Smokey Joe's bar on the night Amy Willard disappeared. Police re-examined the evidence, looking for any clues that would tie Bomar to the murder. 1 year after her daughter's death, Gail Willard, who worked as an emergency room nurse, asked to see pictures of Amy's injuries.
I looked at the picture of what they were calling a diamond-shaped pattern, and I said, this isn't a diamond-shaped pattern, this is a burn. That was not a burn from a flame. It was either a burn that her body came in contact with something that had the ridges on it, but it was a burn imprint, and it was uneven.
Investigators immediately searched for Bomar's Ford Escort, the car he was driving at the time Amy disappeared, but they got bad news. The car had been involved in an automobile accident a few months after Amy's disappearance.
So they tracked the towing company and asked where that car was towed to. They went to a location and found a car that was the green Ford Escort that had been actually sitting in a field next to this tow truck company for almost a year's time. So it had been, there's a potential piece of great evidence that has not had the chance to be forensically analyzed.
An external examination of the Escort showed slight damage to the front bumper. At least one of the car's tires was a Firestone 440 13-inch tire, the same type of tire which made the impression found at the crime scene.
Our latent print examiner in Harrisburg was able to say that the tire was not only consistent in make, model, size, but also in wear, which is helpful. It's another piece to the puzzle. So the forensics in our case were absolutely critical.
Bomar's car had been exposed to the elements without its roof for almost a year, so it was no surprise that police could find no trace of blood inside the car.
In a previous employment, he had worked in a hospital, in an operating room, where he had learned all of the techniques of cleaning up blood.
Until police took a much closer look.
We literally took the car apart. We removed the seats, we removed the carpeting, we did vacuumings for trace evidence. We literally took the car apart. We took the door panel apart, and behind the door panel we found some blood.
Tests later showed that the blood found on the passenger's door was Amy Willard's. But the most shocking discovery was something police noticed underneath the vehicle as it was being towed.
Look at this. That's it.
As the sun was shining down underneath the car, it was illuminating the oil pan. And looking at the oil pan, we were both in agreement right then and there that that was the same mark that was left on Amy Willard's body.
The pattern of X's and O's on the oil pan was eerily similar to the marks on Amy's body. An expert at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology confirmed that the pattern on the oil pan was consistent with the marks on Amy's body.
All rapists, and to a certain degree serial killers, pick their victims based on a fantasy. They have a fantasy in their head of what all violent crime starts with a fantasy.
Prosecutors believe that Amy Willard first caught Arthur Bomar's attention in Smokey Joe's bar. From there, they believe Bomar followed Amy out of the bar and along Route 476 as she drove home. When Amy was about to exit the highway, prosecutors believe Bomar bumped her car, causing her to pull over. The contact left marks on the bumpers of both cars. As she left her vehicle, Bomar struck her with the tire iron, causing the blood spatter on the guardrail. Then dragged her to his car. Where he took Amy from there, no one knows. But the forensic evidence clearly shows that Bomar's Firestone tire left the tire impression at the crime scene. And that Bomar ran over Amy with his vehicle, burning her skin, leaving the imprint of the car's oil pan on her torso. He then left her body in the deserted lot and returned to the scene of the crime to dispose of Amy's clothing. Ironically, Bomar himself provided the most damning piece of evidence. The semen from Amy's rape test kit matched Arthur Bomar's DNA profile. Before Bomar's murder trial, police found the skeletal remains of Maria Cubanos in nearby Bucks County, Pennsylvania. When Bomar was arrested, he was driving Cubanos' automobile. Maria's body was found less than 20 miles from Arthur Bomar's residence and 30 miles from where Amy was abducted. Like Amy, Maria died from head injuries caused by a blunt instrument.
I know that he's still clearly suspected of the disappearance and murder of Maria Cubanos. It's been publicly reported, and authorities look at other things, but I can't, I really shouldn't say anything more than that.
During the trial, the defense argued that Bomar was neglected as a child and had a low IQ. Bomar had to be restrained several times during the trial because of violent outbursts. Outside the courthouse, Bomar's family took their frustrations out on the media.
We'll just talk. We'll stay away from you. We'll stay away from you. We'll stay away from you.
His stepbrother and his mother lashed out at news crews covering the trial.
Miss Ganges. Ma'am, don't hit him.
Arthur Bomar was convicted of rape and first-degree murder and was sentenced to death. Bomar's reaction?
When he was convicted and sentenced to death, he turned around and threatened me with both fingers in the air, telling me to you, Mrs. Willard, and your 2 kids.
He was just a stone-cold killer and a real predator. I have, in my career, never really faced anybody that I felt was as dangerous, as remorseless, and as cold as Arthur Bomar.
He doesn't deserve for anyone to ever think about him again. He is just a vile, evil man.
I think in the end, without the DNA, without the tire impression, without the oil pan impression, I think we would have been very hard-pressed to have the success that we did.
In 1999, a minister's wife was found dead in an overflowing bathtub in her home in South Dakota. Her cryptic suicide note left questions about her state of mind and her sense of time. Forensic science provided those answers. This peaceful house of God is the United Presbyterian Church. Each Sunday morning, it opens its doors to the faithful of Woolsey, South Dakota. The town is no more than a handful of dirt roads just off Highway 14, and several farms out on the blustery prairie. The pastor of this congregation was Reverend Bill Guthrie. He and his wife Sharon lived in the parsonage next door to the church.
He was a very strong minister, probably the most intelligent man when it came to the Bible.
Sharon Guthrie also helped her husband with church duties.
She did children's message. It was before the sermon. Tell him a story and send him with a package of Smarties to go back and sit down, little candy Smarties.
The Guthries were looking forward to the wedding of their second daughter, Jenna Lou. But Sharon Guthrie would never see that day. Just after dawn, On May 14, 1999, Reverend Guthrie called an ambulance. He had discovered his wife unconscious in the bathtub.
She's had an accident.
When emergency personnel arrived, they performed CPR and restarted her heart. In the ambulance, she was placed on a respirator, but she never regained consciousness. Despite the best medical care in the area, emergency room doctors could find no signs of brain activity.
We all decided at that point that it just was time to let her go.
The next day, Sharon Guthrie was pronounced dead. When the sheriff asked Reverend Guthrie about the incident, he said his wife was fine when he left home to go to the church to say his daily prayers.
When he was leaving the house to go to the church, his wife was drawing her bath water and was getting ready to take a bath. He said he went to the church, was there maybe 10 minutes, came back to the house.
Guthrie said he found his wife face down in the overflowing bathtub. Guthrie said he tried to pull her body out of the tub, but was unsuccessful. All he could do was empty the tub and turn her body over before calling the ambulance.
We just figured we were dealing with some sort of an accident, you know, where this lady had had a seizure or heart attack or something while she was taking a bath.
Dr. Brad Randall performed the autopsy and found no signs of trauma or illness. Fortunately, the emergency room personnel had taken blood samples when she was first brought to the hospital, which the pathologist could analyze.
So we had samples from a living individual rather than a dead individual, which toxicology in dead people is a little more difficult than working with an actual living individual. So we were lucky to have those samples to work with.
The samples revealed 3 medications in Sharon's system. 2 were medications she had been prescribed and were in relatively low concentrations. But there was 1 drug in her system she had not been prescribed.
The most important drug was a drug called temazepam, which is a benzodiazepine that was present in very high concentrations. It is a drug not commonly associated with lethal overdoses.
Temazepam is a sedative. The level in Sharon Guthrie's system would definitely render someone unconscious. Although Randall could not be certain how many capsules were taken.
Probably greater than 5 to 10, somewhere in that category or more.
Dr. Randall listed the cause of death as drowning, with the temazepam overdose a contributing factor. The manner of death was undetermined. Was it suicide? Or could it have been murder? 3 weeks after Sharon Guthrie's death, her daughter Jana Lou decided to go ahead with her wedding as planned.
I talked to my dad about it. I talked to family about it, asked what they thought we should do, and I talked to my husband about it, and we decided that my mom would have wanted us to do it. My dad actually performed the ceremony.
Meanwhile, Detective Jerry Lindbergh was assigned to investigate Sharon Guthrie's death. Unfortunately, the scene of the drowning had not been preserved for evaluation.
The result of her being alive and taken to a hospital out of town, the place was left open. A lot of the evidence was destroyed because people came in, the good neighbor thing, cleaned up, brought lunches, and so on.
But investigators discovered the source of the temazepam in Sharon's system. It had been prescribed for her husband, Bill. Bill Guthrie suspected his wife had accidentally ingested the pills while sleepwalking. But none of her 3 daughters recall Sharon ever sleepwalking, and investigators found something suspicious. A few weeks before Sharon's death, Bill Guthrie filled his original prescription for temazepam at one pharmacy and then went to a second pharmacy, told them he had lost his first prescription and got a second one. Another inconsistency was Bill's clothing on the morning of Sharon's death. Bill told the sheriff he had tried to lift his wife out of the bathtub when he first found her. Yet, witnesses said that his clothing was completely dry when the ambulance crew arrived.
He was dry. If you spend any time at all wrestling around with a wet individual, you're going to get wet.
And investigators learned the pastor had some secrets.
A girlfriend in Nebraska. In fact, it had been town gossip just before they left the community and came to Woolsey. Probably part of the reason he came up here is because of that.
I knew her from when they were at their previous church. I knew my mom didn't like her, but I never really knew why.
Guthrie's mistress was a leading member of his former church in Nebraska. The affair continued even after Guthrie moved to South Dakota. When Guthrie took the job in Woolsey, he told the church council that he needed to return to Nebraska for medical counseling because he was impotent.
I think on some occasions they even paid his mileage. And he never went to counseling. He was going back to continue this affair.
But eventually, Guthrie's mistress grew dissatisfied with their clandestine affair.
Basically, and these are her words, that all they would do is have sex. And he would stay in the motel room. They couldn't go out to eat, couldn't go to a movie. And she was tired of that. And she wanted something more, so she put some pressure on him, and he never did anything. And then finally in January, she broke up with him.
And there was no evidence that Bill Guthrie was impotent.
Not from what his girlfriend told us. Apparently he was able to perform adequately and did on frequent occasions.
Investigators now considered Bill Guthrie a suspect in his wife's death. But adultery and prescription fraud is one thing, but murder is another. Police enlisted Bill's oldest daughter, Suzanne, to find out if her father played a role in her mother's death. She agreed to confront her father with a hidden microphone.
I thought maybe I could plead as a daughter, for him to just be honest with me.
I need to know some answers.
Okay, ask.
You had an affair.
No. Where did you hear that?
I've heard it from everybody, Dad. They have a lot on you, Dad. And I need to know the truth in all of this. I'm on your side. I don't want to think that you've done the things that you've done.
What do you think that I did?
They think you did, Mom. There's medicine missing.
I don't know anything about medicine that's missing.
And he still totally denied everything from his affair to getting the medication.
In late July, investigators confiscated the church computer in order to see the email correspondence between the pastor and his lover in Nebraska. The emails revealed nothing. But police wondered if there was information hidden somewhere on the computer's hard drive. To find out, they turned to an expert in the new field of computer forensics. After Sharon Guthrie's suspicious drowning, police confiscated the Guthrie's computer to see if it contained possible evidence. Judd Robbins is an expert in the field of computer forensics. He says that most of us know very little about how computers really work.
The most common misconception is that you can delete data by asking your program or your operating system to delete it, and that it's gone. It isn't.
That's because hitting the delete key simply marks that material and the memory it uses as available for use in the future.
There is residual traces of their existence in that space. And so the equivalent in a computer system is that there is often a residual indication that you were there. It's now traced. Evidentiary value is tremendous if it's found before the space gets re-rented or released, or in the computer, reused by a new file.
The computer information trail may also show when files are created, downloaded, or edited. Robbins used special software to search the memory for anything related to temazepam. He discovered there had been numerous internet searches about sleeping pills just a month before Sharon died. Someone had also downloaded numerous articles about temazepam, which had been found in Sharon's system.
Temazepam is the only sleeping pill that comes in the capsule form that you can take apart, and it has powder inside, so it's easy to take apart and put it into something.
And Robbins found other information on the hard drive that he thought might be of value.
I didn't know exactly how or when she died, so I called Mike Moore and asked.
And I said, why? And he goes, well, there seems to be a lot of information in here on bathtub accidents. And I then told him that she drowned in a bathtub.
The searches were done the month before Sharon died, with the last one completed on April 27th.
The searches were done in April and she died in May.
On April 29th, Guthrie asked his doctor for a prescription for temazepam and filled it at the 2 different pharmacies. The prescription was filled again on May 12th and 13th. On May 14th, a heavily drugged Sharon Guthrie drowned in her tub. Based on the computer evidence, Bill Guthrie was arrested and charged with murder. The prosecution theorized that Guthrie wanted out of his marriage, but feared a divorce would jeopardize his position as a pastor. So he looked for ways to make her death look like an accident. And the way he may have done it was to lace her favorite drink, chocolate milk, with an overdose of sedatives.
She drank it every day. That was just her thing. She just always drank chocolate milk. She loved chocolate milk.
Prosecutors believe that on the morning of her death, Bill Guthrie put the temazepam in his wife's chocolate milk, then gave it to her in bed before going to the church. After the drugs went into effect, he placed his wife, now unconscious, into the tub, filled it with water, and let her drown.
I felt we had a pretty good circumstantial case, but all our evidence was circumstantial.
But Jenna Lou Simpson still wasn't convinced that her father was a murderer. She says her mother took an overdose of Benadryl, an allergy medication, a few weeks earlier and required medical attention.
I thought it was accidental. I thought that she had done it before with the Benadryl. She had done it before with some herbal stuff. I thought she probably, did it again just to get some attention.
People who filled church pews to hear Bill Guthrie preach now filled the wooden benches of the Beetle County Courthouse.
It was packed every day. People get here sometimes at 7 o'clock in the morning so they get a seat.
Prosecutor Mike Moore was confident of his case. Then, Moore got the shock of his life. The defense introduced a suicide note from Sharon Guthrie. At his murder trial, Bill Guthrie revealed that several weeks after her death, he found a suicide note from his wife, Sharon. For some unexplained reason, it was hidden in a liturgy book in the church office.
A bunch of things race through your head. You're upset, you're shocked.
The note was typed on a computer, but was unsigned. It was dated May 13th, 1999, the day before Sharon died, and addressed to her daughter.
Dear Suzanne, I am sorry I ruined your wedding. Your dad told me about your concerns of my interfering in Jenna Lou's and the possibility I might ruin hers. I won't be there, so put your mind at ease. You will understand after the wedding is done. I love you all, Mom.
The note referred to a minor incident that occurred at Suzanne's wedding a few years earlier. Prosecutor Mike Moore asked his computer forensic expert, Judd Robbins, to re-examine the hard drive of the church's computer to see if he could find any trace of the suicide note. But he found none. Fingerprint expert Cindy Orton analyzed the note, spraying it with the chemical ninhydrin.
If an individual writes a suicide note and they are truly contemplating suicide, they have a tendency to perspire. Using ninhydrin is a good reagent because it does look for amino acids, which comes from sweat.
Steam from a household iron accelerated the process, revealing numerous fingerprints.
Somebody was perspiring quite heavily while they were handling that document. For what reason, I don't know.
Bill Guthrie said he had given the note directly to his lawyer, but the prints on the note did not match either Guthrie or his attorney. It was impossible to tell whether the prints were Sharon's, since she had never been fingerprinted even at her autopsy. But if the note was typed on a computer, and it didn't come from the computer in the church, where did it come from? Police discovered that Guthrie owned a second computer which he had given to his daughter and son-in-law shortly before his trial. They now turned it over to the state's attorney.
The only thing we really wanted was the truth, to know exactly what happened, whether it be proven his innocence or proven his guilt, that was up to them.
Judd Robbins examined the hard drive from this second computer. On it, Robbins discovered a document file entitled Sharon. The main text was missing, but it had the same closing line as the suicide note and had the same date, May 13th. Both documents had the same typographical error, no space between the comma and the year.
So we had margins the same, we had fonts the same, we had words the same.
The file had been created in August, 3 months after Sharon died. Robbins also found evidence that the note was written by Bill Guthrie.
This suicide note was constructed in an interspliced, intertwined fashion with several of his sermons in the month of August, so that I could construct a timeline of working on sermon, working on suicide note, working on sermon.
I think at that point it made me realize that he had done something, that he had done this, and that he was guilty for this.
I thought the jury would see what I was seeing, that this was this guy's last-ditch effort to get away with killing his wife, and we caught him at it.
The jury convicted William Guthrie of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. After the trial, Sharon Guthrie's body was exhumed so that she could be reburied in her native Nebraska. Sharon's fingerprints were finally obtained. Cynthia Orton compared Sharon's prints to those on the suicide note. They did not match.
Well, the question that leaves me with is whose fingerprints are on that document?
For now, that question remains a mystery. Daughter Suzanne believes her father is guilty. But despite the computer forensic evidence, her sister Jenna Lou believes her father is innocent and stays in contact with him through phone calls and letters.
I've lost my mother, my father, and my sisters throughout all this. And I lost them all within a year.
The sisters no longer speak. The prosecutor says forensic science solved this case. Without it, he says Bill Guthrie would be a free man.
Without those sciences, you don't have a case. If you don't have the pathologist finding drugs, if you don't have the computer expert finding that stuff on the computer, you don't have a case.
young woman stopped her car along a busy highway in California. She was never seen again. For 3 years, the search for her whereabouts continued, but the trail eventually turned cold. So cold that forensic scientists needed new techniques to solve it. 23-year-old Denise Huber lived with her parents in Newport Beach, California, an upscale suburb outside of Los Angeles.
She just graduated from college, and I think she just wanted to have fun and before she settled down into a job.
Denise worked as a waitress and a part-time sales assistant at Bloomingdale's. At 5'9", the striking blue-eyed brunette had no trouble attracting dates. Her most recent boyfriend was Steve Horrocks.
He's a friendly, outgoing person, likes to have fun. I know that's what she would always say. Steve was so much fun.
On Sunday night, June 2nd, 1991, Steve and Denise planned to see the Morrissey rock band perform in Inglewood. But at the last minute, Steve couldn't get off from work. Disappointed but undeterred, Denise asked a casual friend, Robert Calvert, to go with her.
She said, "I'll be home late." And I remember saying, "Well, don't be too late, you know, because I always worry when you're not home on time."
After the concert, Denise and Rob stopped at the El Paso Cantina for a drink, where Denise met an old acquaintance whom we'll call Ross.
Ross had a romantic feelings for her in the past. He did ask her to go with him that night. He wanted her to go home with him, which she did not do.
Denise and Rob left the restaurant around 1 o'clock in the morning, and Denise dropped Rob off at his home. Rob was the last known person to see Denise Huber.
Well, I think in the morning when she wasn't there, obviously there was some concern, but we didn't keep that close of tabs on her either. I mean, she was 23 years old and an adult and totally trustworthy.
Her abandoned car was found along the Costa Mesa Freeway, 3 miles from home, with a flat tire.
It didn't look like anything had occurred at the vehicle. It was parked between 2 call boxes that were never used that night.
In my mind, I just knew something horrible had happened, because Denise wasn't the kind of person that would just disappear without telling us.
The Costa Mesa police dispatched investigators to the scene.
The inside of the car itself appeared to be clean. There was no blood there. There didn't appear to be any windows broken. There didn't appear to be any damage to the car.
Her purse and shoes were gone, like she'd gotten out of her car and left. The flashers were on the car, like the car had broken down and she was going to get out and go walk for help.
Search dogs picked up a scent on the side of the freeway, but soon lost it. Police then canvassed the neighborhoods near the highway. But no one had seen her. It appeared Denise Huber had simply vanished.
It's worse than if I think I was afraid for my own death, because I was so afraid what happened to Denise. She was so precious.
Police used search helicopters and all other means to look for 23-year-old Denise Huber after her abandoned car was found along a busy highway.
You could hear them from our house, and you know what they're looking for, and you pray they don't find what they're looking for, because it's got to be, obviously, got to be a body that they're looking for. And it's horrible. It's the most horrible feeling you could ever have. It's like I couldn't breathe for I don't know how long.
Police examined the interior of Denise's car and found no foreign fingerprints. An analysis of the flat tire revealed it had not been tampered with.
It just blew out from being underinflated, got too hot, and the sidewall failed. It just went flat.
While the physical evidence led nowhere, police interviewed the last known person to see Denise, her date from the night before, Robert Calvert.
Rob could have been infatuated with her and could have been upset because there was no romantic contact between the two of them.
Police also looked into Denise's relationship with Steve Horrocks, the boyfriend who was supposed to accompany Denise to the concert but backed out at the last minute.
Steve Horrocks was, again, cooperative. Any information we needed from him, he was always willing to give it.
Police also tracked down Ross, the acquaintance Denise met at the El Cantina restaurant.
Ross was able to put himself in an alibi situation to show that he did not go follow her after she dropped Rob off.
I never gave up hope that she'd be found alive. We did everything from thinking that she might have had a boyfriend that the folks didn't know about and maybe left the state, left the city, eloped.
Desperate for leads, investigators and Denise's family turned to the media.
All I knew was get a picture in front of people. Get the story out. And the news media, they were wonderful because every time we have anything going on, they would be there and they'd show it. So the community, really, it was like it was their daughter.
We made buttons with Denise's picture that said, "Pray for Denise." We had bumper stickers that all of our police units carried and were available all over the community. There was a large banner that was placed along the 73 freeway here in Costa Mesa.
The media attention produced hundreds of tips. Most were well-intentioned. Some were not.
We'd hear from psychics. We'd hear from crackpots. We'd hear from people that would try and get money from us.
350 miles away in Prescott, Arizona, a man living in a well-to-do neighborhood called local police to report something suspicious in his neighbor's driveway. It was a Ryder truck with California license plates. It had an extension cord coming out of the back of the truck. The neighbor said it was plugged into an electrical socket on the side of the house. Whatever was inside the truck was running 24 hours a day. A search of the truck revealed it had been stolen in California. Inside was an industrial-sized freezer in the cargo area.
And inside the freezer was a large black garbage bag, and they felt it and believed what they felt was an arm of a person. I recall seeing 2 arms coming back with the hands handcuffed and a ring. I remember seeing jewelry, and I was really shocked.
And for the medical examiner, it would be the most difficult case she had ever encountered. For the past year, a stolen Ryder truck containing a freezer with a human body inside had been parked at the home of 39-year-old John Familaro, a handyman and painter.
Mr. Familaro was very calm, he was very polite, and he just really didn't have much to say about it. But he seemed kind of indifferent to the whole thing.
The contents of the freezer were sent to the Maricopa County Coroner's Office. Dr. Ann Buchholz handled the case.
Obviously, it's a homicide or at least a hidden body for some reason. And because if it's clandestine nature, you're like, okay, so we got an evidentiary thing here. Let's think homicide. Let's think the worst. And I said, yes, it's a female. She also had some female jewelry evident and long fingernails. The handcuffs were evident, and we didn't see much in the way of clothing. She appeared to be naked.
Thawing the body would cause rapid decomposition, so Dr. Buchholz needed to collect evidence quickly or lose it forever.
I took a clean scalpel handle and actually scraped some of the watery fluid into jars and held it that way. I thought, well, at least we can collect the specimens. It was sheer luck that we even got any sperm at all in a woman who's frozen 3 years.
Dr. Buchholz removed the handcuffs and defrosted the hands slowly.
When they're frozen, the skin is fairly symmetrical and intact until she starts losing the fluids, and then the skin will start shriveling, even in the fingertips. In fact, that's where it starts, one of the first. We got all the prints that first day, and they're actually rolled onto a fingerprint card, just as if they were a person who's being arrested. It's the same process on a dead person.
When they entered the prints into their computer database of missing persons, they immediately found a match. It was Denise Huber, who had been missing for 3 years.
They were able to do the fingerprints, and that's something I never even thought of. I never imagined that we would have that kind of evidence after 3 years.
Meanwhile, John Famularo refused to explain why Denise's body was in his freezer 350 miles away from where she disappeared. So police searched Famularo's home and the home of his mother, who lived next door.
She was quite taken back that we had also secured what we found to be her home. She knew nothing about John having girlfriends or who it might be, and basically sat up a lawn chair across the street and just sat there and watched us for days.
Police found a box marked Christmas on a shelf in Famularo's garage. Inside was Denise's bloody clothing, her driver's license, and her high-heeled shoes. The shoes were scuffed and damaged, as if she had been dragged across highway paving. And police found credit card receipts that showed Famularo had bought the freezer just days after Denise's disappearance. They also discovered blood-stained clothing belonging to John Famularo.
They didn't know whose blood it was. They didn't know if it was Denise's, some other person's, a mixture, Mr. Famularo's. So they needed a sample of Denise's blood. Well, we didn't have blood. So we ended up sending them some bone marrow.
The DNA extracted from Denise Huber's bone marrow matched the DNA in the blood on Famularo's clothes. In Famularo's basement, police found a police officer's uniform and a dungeon.
I think that all showed me he was just that type of person, not the mild-mannered person he was when I spoke to him. He had that very dark, violent other side, and was becoming more and more apparent as the case progressed on.
One of his girlfriends that we talked to said that, yeah, he had some weird sexual fantasies. One of the girls had been handcuffed and left exposed, naked and handcuffed, left exposed to an open window.
The evidence implicated Famularo in the disappearance and death of Denise Huber, but it did not explain how she died.
We took off 2 or 3 black plastic bags that had encased the whole body. And inside that were some smaller white plastic bags which covered the head. And when we removed that and we started defrosting her, we actually found a gag-type device over her face and over her mouth area. It was a piece of duct tape that had been taped over her upper mouth, nose area.
Dr. Buchholz discovered that Denise's skull had been severely damaged. Dr. Laura Fulginetti, a forensic anthropologist, was asked to reconstruct the skull for further analysis.
You look for parts that go together naturally, and you'd start with the vault or the top round part of the head, and then you proceed towards the face. And the reason I do it that way is because the face typically has the smallest, most complicated pieces, and you want to have your framework built so that when you get to the face, you have something to put the face back onto.
The forensic analysis would reveal not only how Denise Huber died, but where. search, Denise Huber's body was found in a freezer in Arizona. Forensic investigators reconstructed her skull in an effort to understand how she died.
You can see patterned injuries of 2 different varieties, indicating 2 different weapons were used, and you can also see little pieces of plastic that are caught in those fractures.
That told us that the bags were in place when she received the blows to the head.
And Dr. Fulginetti discovered Denise had been hit 31 times.
It's horrifying. And if I stop too long to think about how she felt when she was by the freeway, I'm paralyzed and I can't do my job. So I don't think about that until it's all over and done with. For me, it's a matter of, here's the puzzle, my job is to put the puzzle together and interpret the puzzle, and then I can go home and cry in the shower.
The semen found on Denise's clothing matched John Famillaro's DNA profile.
She was innocent, an innocent victim. And it could have been anybody's sister. It could have been you. It could have been your sister, your friend. And that's scary. It really hurts you emotionally at that point when you realize that. I'll be honest, I won't drive on the interstate and allow anyone to help me because of this.
Police also discovered that John Famillaro was working in Newport Beach, California at the time Denise disappeared. He had rented the front portion of this warehouse for his painting business.
They talked to people who rented the unit after he had moved out and abandoned it about what condition the unit was in, and they pointed us to this area in the corner where they found a large brown stain that washed out with the hose, and we thought, well, we know dried blood is very soluble in water, it could be washed away.
Initial tests revealed nothing. Investigators decided to wait until dark and use luminol, which fluoresces or glows when it comes into contact with the iron component in blood.
We sprayed it out of a little hand sprayer. Eventually we checked the whole warehouse, and the only thing we ever found was just that blood in the corner of the warehouse.
The DNA from those blood stains matched Denise Huber's DNA. And the nail gun found in the warehouse matched the indentations in Denise's skull. Based on the forensic evidence, prosecutors believe that when Denise's tire went flat, Famillaro stopped and offered to help. At some point, he overpowered her and took her to his warehouse a few miles away. There, he killed her. He stored the body in a freezer he bought a few days after he killed Denise. 2 years later, he stole the Ryder truck and took the freezer with Denise's body in it with him when he moved to Arizona. He kept the truck in his driveway, with the freezer running constantly.
He's kind of a sick guy. That's his thing.
John has been violent to other people, and it's escalated up to the point of murder, but I don't think Denise has been the only one.
On June 20th, 1997, 6 years after Denise disappeared, John Famillaro was tried and convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death.
Forensics it was challenged every step of the way here in court, even before in court. I think a lot of it went to the state Supreme Court, but every challenge was beat back because of great forensics and great police work.
I wanted to know the truth, and some of it was horrible. But I'd rather have the answers than just be wondering in my mind, because sometimes you imagine things as bad or worse than what they were.
This really is the way it's supposed to be done, and then it makes you work harder on the next one. And when you're about to throw your hands up in despair, you think, Denise Huber, you did that case, you got it reconstructed, keep at it. There is an answer here.
In the midst of a promising dance career, Tracy Jo Shine suddenly dropped out of school and shortly afterward disappeared. 12 years later, debris from an old refrigerator would warm up what had become a very cold case. Tracy Jo Shine grew up in Houston, Texas. She was a good student, a Girl Scout, and played sports. But her real interest, her passion, was dance. At the age of 13, she auditioned and was accepted at the prestigious high school for performing arts in Houston. It was a dream come true. And while away at school, Tracy Jo began to experiment with drugs.
That's when she started having the problem. She started meeting the wrong people and started getting involved in taking drugs. And I, at that time, just really didn't understand it or didn't know what to do.
She started skipping classes, her grades began to slip, and she became romantically involved with 31-year-old Michael Neal, who had recently been released from prison.
First time I'd met him and she brought him over to my apartment, he seemed to be polite enough and seemed to be nice enough.
Eventually, Tracy Jo abandoned her dreams of a career in dance, dropped out of school, and at the age of 18, moved in with her boyfriend Michael and his mother. Tracy Jo's mother didn't know what to do next.
Tracy was not the Tracy that she was before she did the drugs. Tracy had become someone else that was controlled by drugs. And I just kept praying that, you know, she'd just live through this and get out of all of it, and then we could have our lives together again and go on.
Michael Neal had recently been implicated in a racially motivated drive-by shooting. Detective Marcel Dion went to Neal's home to question him. Neal wasn't home, but Tracy Jo was.
How long have you known him? Tracy had just taken a shot. The syringe was still there on the couch right there with her. At first, you could make heads or tails out of anything she was saying.
So he arrested Tracy Jo for using drugs.
She'd been arrested 2 other times, I believe, for her drug problem. She said she had tried to stop.
I had attempted to see if there was some way that I could get Tracy committed to a drug program. And I was finding that there was a waiting list at different places, and there really wasn't a whole lot I could do since she wasn't a child anymore.
At police headquarters, Tracy Jo offered to make a deal. She said her boyfriend, Michael, was the one who committed the drive-by shooting, and she agreed to testify against him in return for a lighter sentence for her drug charge. Detective Dion agreed to the deal. Early the next morning, Michael Neal walked into police headquarters and put up the bail for Tracy Jo. She was never seen again.
Nobody had seen or heard from her. So at that point is you start calling her friends and start calling anybody that she'd been associated with. Well, nobody had seen her, or nobody had heard from her.
Marcel Dion discovered that Michael Neal was a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, a violent white supremacist group. This explained Neal's alleged involvement in the drive-by shooting, which occurred in a black neighborhood. When Dion asked Michael Neal about Tracy Jo's whereabouts, he said that Tracy Jo left home shortly after her arrest and that he hadn't seen her since. Dion wasn't so sure. day after Tracy Jo Shine was released from prison on drug charges, she visited her mother to borrow some money. Although Tracy Jo had always stayed in touch with her mother and brother, that visit was the last time her family saw her. Tracy Jo had simply dropped out of sight.
Something was the matter. I, for some reason, just felt something was wrong.
Virginia contacted Tracy Jo's boyfriend, Michael Neal.
I called over there to find out about Tracy, because I hadn't heard from her in a couple of weeks, and to see what was happening. And they told me she wasn't there anymore.
When Michael Neal wasn't forthcoming, Virginia had no other choice but to file a missing persons report. Detective Marcel Dion immediately suspected foul play. Then, a few weeks later, Dion received an anonymous telephone call.
Yes, I'd like to report a murder that
She was telling me about this girl that was apparently killed by her boyfriend, stuffed in a refrigerator, and taken out to a car lot.
The informant eventually revealed the identity of the dead girl. It was Tracy Jo Shine. The informant also said that the refrigerator used to store Tracy Jo's body was still at the used car lot owned by Michael Neal and his brother Robert. Armed with a search warrant, detectives went to the car lot, found the refrigerator, but discovered it had recently been cleaned with bleach.
We took the refrigerator apart. We collected a piece of human tissue from the freezer unit, and it had some hair follicles on it.
Forensic scientists attempted an RFLP DNA enzyme analysis on that tissue, but were unsuccessful. The hair was compared visually to hair taken from Tracy Jo's hairbrush, but that comparison was inconclusive. With no other leads, Detective Dion spent the next few months looking all over Houston, anywhere he suspected a body might have been buried.
I took a lot of heat. Everybody thought I was crazy because I was digging up half of Harris County. I was draining ponds. We used horses. We used four-wheelers. I was given the nickname of Digger because every time I received a phone call, I was digging somewhere.
But none of the leads were fruitful.
I knew that she had to be out there somewhere. I just wouldn't give up.
Dion also questioned Michael Neal's mother, Barbara, at her consignment shop. There, Dion noticed something suspicious. In the display case was some women's jewelry, which was identical to jewelry owned by Tracy Jo Shine.
I just couldn't believe the way they had taken Tracy Jo's jewelry and placed it in a glass case at the business they were running and selling it over the counter.
Barbara McAllister told police that after Tracy Jo moved out of her home, she simply took the jewelry Tracy Jo left behind and was trying to sell it. Although it may have been in poor taste, it still didn't prove foul play. But with nowhere else to turn, the investigation faltered. Dion had no choice but to attend to other cases.
I ordered all the evidence plus the refrigerator stored in our property room. And basically just about every year, almost to the day, they would call me and want to get rid of the refrigerator. And I kept telling them, no, this is an open case, I'm still working it.
Michael Neal was later arrested for another shooting incident and was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison. His brother Robert Neal was arrested on a methamphetamine charge. He too was convicted and sent to prison. Despite their convictions, the Neal brothers continued to insist they knew nothing about Tracy Jo's disappearance. It would take another 10 years before a cold case unit took a fresh look at the disappearance of Tracy Jo Shine. Nothing was heard from Tracy Jo Shine for over a decade. and police could find no solid evidence of what might have happened to her. During those years, there had been no credit card activity, no applications for driver's licenses, no history of employment, nothing. Tracy Joe's ex-boyfriend, Michael Neal, and his brother Robert were serving time in prison for crimes unrelated to her disappearance. Then, in 1999, the Harris County Sheriff's Department formed a new cold case unit headed by Detective Roger Wedgeworth and Harry Fakaris. The Tracy Joe Shine case was one of the first to cross their desk.
Tracy's like a lot of young girls. If you look at her upbringing, she was a Girl Scout, very much loved by her mother, just a normal kid who goes to high school, goes to proms and everything, and she got mixed up in drugs. And of course, one of the worst mistakes of her life was meeting our suspect in this case, Michael Neal.
As a first step, they decided to retest the tissue sample found in Michael Neal's refrigerator with the new, more sophisticated PCR DNA test. But after more than 12 years, the sample was too badly degraded. Then there was another setback. The hair found with the tissue sample could not be located. But Fakaris and Wedgeworth were astonished to learn that the refrigerator was still in the Sheriff's Department property room. In a long shot, investigators decided to take a look at the refrigerator one more time.
We opened it up and it looked fairly clean, but we knew that it had been laid down on its back. And we thought if there was any kind of body fluids or any kind of evidence that may have drained into the wiring harness on the backside of it.
Forensic scientists swabbed every square inch of the refrigerator, and this time included the wiring and harness areas for any biological material that might be present.
There's so many nooks and crannies in a refrigerator or any other machine like that that body fluid and things like that's going to seep through. It would be impossible probably to clean it all.
The swabs were sent to the forensic lab.
I was skeptical that we would find anything of any value in the refrigerator, simply because of the amount of time that it had been stored and the fact that, like so many other evidence storage areas, the environment was not ideal for preserving the evidence.
When Watson looked closer at the swabs, he discovered what appeared to be a piece of human skin. Watson tested that skin sample using a PCR DNA test. PCR testing essentially takes minute traces of DNA, then amplifies or makes enough copies of it so that it can be analyzed. The analysis was long and arduous, and unfortunately was unsuccessful. After months of frustration, Watson heard about a new test the FBI laboratory had been experimenting with, a test using mitochondrial DNA. Traditional DNA testing uses DNA from the cell's nucleus. Mitochondrial DNA is taken from the mitochondria, which exists outside of the cell's nucleus. It's not as precise as traditional DNA testing, but in some cases, it's all scientists can get. And this time, Watson was successful. The next step was to find a known sample of Tracy Joe Shine's DNA for comparison. Bill Watson took letters written by Tracy Joe over a decade earlier to see if her DNA could be identified in the saliva from the envelope flaps. But the DNA from the saliva was too badly degraded. Mitochondrial DNA is passed from generation to generation maternally, meaning that Tracy Joe's mitochondrial DNA profile would be identical to her mother's.
Even though we didn't have a sample from Tracy Joe to compare to the tissue that was inside the refrigerator, we did have her mother, and we were able to get a mitochondrial profile from her mother.
When the mitochondrial DNA from the refrigerator was compared to Virginia Shine, it matched. The biological material most likely was that of Tracy Jo Shine. Had Tracy Jo's DNA been discovered on the handle of the refrigerator, that might not have been unusual. But skin found on wiring on the back harness was a completely different matter.
It was a wonderful, wonderful feeling. It's you know, you finally felt like all that hard work is finally coming together. But even whenever we got that, we knew that this guy would never do the right thing and step up to the plate and tell the truth.
With this discovery, Michael Neal was charged with murder. His brother Robert, hoping to gain an early release from prison for his drug conviction, offered to make a deal.
After all these years that he'd spent in prison, I guess he finally realized he would never be getting out of prison unless he did something.
We know you have something to tell us.
And we sat down, worked out a deal, and he gave us his honest testimony, which we felt mostly was honest testimony, and told us what he knew about the case.
Robert not only revealed his brother's involvement in the murder, he also implicated his mother, his sister, and himself. Robert Neal told police that his brother Michael feared Tracy Jo Shine would testify against him for the drive-by shooting in exchange for a lighter sentence for her drug arrest. So when Michael went to bail Tracy Jo out of jail, he did so to eliminate a potential witness.
The most important thing that Robert told us was he actually showed us how Michael Neal killed her. And Robert made this motion like this, like a choking motion. So we knew that she'd been strangled.
Robert said Michael killed Tracy Jo in his bedroom and left her body there for 3 days. The smell of decomposition prompted Michael's mother to look into the couple's bedroom, where she saw the body.
She goes into the bedroom. She sees that she's turning purple. I mean, that's a clue right there that something is not right.
Neal's mother never reported Tracy Jo's death to police. After the body was removed, Robert said his mother and sister cleaned the bedroom and burned incense to remove the odor. Robert admitted helping Michael transport the refrigerator with the body inside to the used car lot the brothers owned.
Robert told us that he never saw the body.
He said his brother just told him, help him move the refrigerator. Basically, don't ask me any questions, and I won't tell you anything. We'll just move this refrigerator out to the car lot. He said, I can assume that Tracy Jo Shine was in there, but I never saw her in there. I never saw her in there.
Robert said he sat outside while Michael placed the body in a 55-gallon drum. Where Michael later took the barrel is unknown. But Michael Neal didn't realize the tissue invisible to the naked eye would lead to his downfall over a dozen years later.
Michael made a lot of mistakes at the very beginning by leaving the body in there for several days, by his mother finding out that Tracy was dead. Instead of immediately disposing of the body, it allowed us to get evidence out of the refrigerator.
The fact is, science always progresses, always moves forward, and as it has, we've been able to develop the type of testing that could let us test those smaller and smaller samples and match it up. So his biggest mistake was in thinking he'd get away with it.
Although prosecutors had no body, Michael Neal was convicted of Tracy Jo Shine's murder and was sentenced to an additional 45 years in prison. He won't be eligible for parole until 2017, when he'll be 60 years old.
Michael Neal can look you straight in the eye, and there's no doubt in my mind that He could cut you, he could shoot you, he could do anything humanly possible to you. Would not change his impression in any way.
His brother Robert is still serving time for his earlier conviction for manufacturing methamphetamine. Michael's mother, Barbara, denied any knowledge of the murder, saying she thought Tracy Jo had died of a drug overdose. Neither Barbara nor her daughter Jeannie were ever prosecuted for their alleged involvement in concealing evidence or abuse of a corpse since the statute of limitations for those crimes had expired. Virginia Shine says she will never stop looking for her daughter's grave, even though Michael Neal stubbornly refuses to say where it is.
The sad part of it is if he's just trying to just keep on being the one in control, is that he won't let us know where she really is, so that I can have some kind of peace there. Because it's not going to be any worse for him to tell me, to tell us the real truth. And so I can't ever forgive him for that.
Marcel Dion's insistence on preserving the refrigerator for all those years provided the crucial forensic evidence necessary for a conviction.
I just couldn't believe it. To me, it was just a huge weight off my back. I've never been so happy over anything in my life.
The amount of effort that went into the sample processing on the front end was as much as you would put in any case, any very difficult case. I mean, it was just, on a scale of 1 to 10, I would say it was an 8 or a 9.
Just after opening a vintage car restoration business, Phil Rouse became seriously ill. Doctors had difficulty finding the cause. But to forensic scientists, it looked like foul play. From the day he found an abandoned Model A Ford in an old cotton warehouse, Phil Rouse knew that vintage automobiles would be his life. For most of his career, Phil was a salesman. In 1997, he quit to finally pursue his dream of starting an antique car restoration business. He called it Top Quality, and it was housed in a garage near his home in Bartlett, Tennessee.
Phil was really excited about going into business. He had, that was his dream.
To no one's surprise, the shop was successful from the day it opened. And with that success came the need to expand. For capital, Phil turned to his best friend and next-door neighbor, Steve White, who was anxious to invest in the business in exchange for part ownership. Phil's good friend, Kimo Coelho, also joined the company.
As a matter of fact, everybody was happy with the way things were going. Everybody was happy we got off to a good start.
It was Phil's knowledge, talent, and experience that made the company so successful.
I've worked on them since I was 15 years old. I guess I bought my first antique car when I think I was 16.
When Phil Rouse became ill just 2 months after the shop opened, it was a serious blow.
I got to where I didn't have any energy, and my stomach gave me a lot of trouble. I had trouble with digestion. I had severe chest pains. My hands and feet began to get numb.
And to make matters worse, medical tests couldn't find the cause.
I had an ultrasound done, a CAT scan, and an ultrasound. And all those tests came up negative.
Inexplicably, Phil's condition continued to get worse. He lost 30 pounds and had difficulty walking, and his cognitive abilities were also affected.
He came home and he says, "Joe, I think I've got Alzheimer's. I'm getting Alzheimer's." And I said, "Why, Phil?" And he said, I forgot my way to the shop.
To protect his investment while Phil was ill, Steve White ran the day-to-day operations of the business. By December, Phil was convinced he was going to die.
I was so sick that night. I was in such bad pain that I actually took my shirt off and laid on the kitchen floor on the linoleum. I thought maybe that cold floor would take the pain and burning out of my stomach.
Restoring automobiles sometimes involves chemicals and solvents that can cause illness if the workplace isn't properly ventilated. Phil wondered whether this had been his problem. But his doctors were doubtful since no one else in the shop became ill. Then Phil became convinced that someone was trying to kill him. So he went to police headquarters with an unusual request. He said if he died, he wanted the police to perform an autopsy because he thought someone was poisoning him. The police were skeptical.
I noticed that the other detectives were walking around, and in fact, one of them was kind of doing this. And I got upset. I got very aggravated with that.
Phil's family thought he was exaggerating.
I wanted proof that something was being done to him. And we said you should have waited.
Nothing in the world could have convinced me that I was wrong that night, or I'd have never gone to the police station. If you didn't think it took some cojones to go down to the police station, you're wrong.
Phil was desperate. He was afraid that nothing would be able to save his life. Just months after opening his vintage car restoration business, Phil Rouse was so sick he could no longer run the business on a day-to-day basis. His best friend, next-door neighbor and business partner, Steve White, was now running the business.
My business partner told me not to worry about it. He said, if you're sick, you stay home. Stay home and get well.
While sitting home, Phil Rouse heard rumors that his company wasn't paying its bills.
We were taking money in, but money was never distributed back to our suppliers to pay their bills.
Rouse went to the bank and discovered that 10 company checks written by his partner had bounced because of insufficient funds. And he also learned why the company had no money.
And when I got copies of the checks, I can be honest with you, I was not happy with what I saw. He was paying for his personal cell phone bill, $70, $80 a month. He was paying for his own military insurance. He was making checks to this local wine and spirits company somewhere close, a store buying booze.
And Phil noticed that Steve White had written a check to a company called American National for $127. When he didn't recognize the company, Rouse decided to call.
She said, it's life insurance. I said, can you tell me more about it? She said, well, it's for $100,000. And the beneficiary and owner of the policy is Steve Allen White.
But the life insurance policy wasn't on Steve White's life. It was on Phil Rouse's. And there was no reciprocal policy on Steve White's life naming Rouse as the beneficiary. Leona White says her husband did nothing wrong, that they were only trying to protect their investment in the event of Phil's death.
Steve wasn't into auto restoring. His involvement in the business had been more from a business management standpoint.
We kept trying to have business meetings so we could see the check book, which we have never seen. And every time we go to have a meeting, Steve would get up and get angry and storm out of the house. So we were getting a little bit suspicious.
The final straw came when Steve White closed the company's bank accounts without telling Phil, who found out through the bank teller.
She said, well, Mr. White came in 2 days ago, walked out of the bank with $2,943 and closed the account. And she said, the reason I mentioned to you, Mr. Rouse, is because there were checks outstanding. And he said he didn't care. He just wanted the money.
Rouse believed that as 50% owner of the business, he had the power to halt all such transactions. But he was wrong. When Phil's lawyer reviewed the partnership agreement, he discovered that Phil only owned 2% of the business. Steve White owned the remaining 98%.
Well, I signed a lot of things in 1997. If Steve came over and said, you need to sign this because this is whatever, we'd sign it.
He was completely duped into signing this contract.
Phil now began to suspect his partner and decided to visit Dr. Kevin Merigian, one of the top forensic toxicologists in the United States.
He was one of the worst cases that I had seen. So, I mean, he was very, very sick.
And I said, well, I think I'm being murdered. I don't know how. I don't know how. I don't know what's being used on me.
Dr. Merigian analyzed Phil's urine tests, which had been done earlier, and he also performed a physical examination. But before the results were in, Phil had more bad news. All of the business assets he brought with him to the company, which included the building and real estate, had been transferred to his partner, Steve White, and put up for sale. Phil Rouse was not only dying, he was now penniless. Phil Rouse began to suspect that the improprieties in his business and his suspicions of being poisoned might somehow be related.
Mr. Rouse wasn't very functional, if you would say, cognitively. He had a lot of the, he had an inability to concentrate, focus. He was very anxious.
To find the cause of the illness, Phil's urine was sent for a heavy metals test. The test revealed Phil had arsenic in his system. A level of 63 is in the high range, but far from lethal. Normally, there is no arsenic in one's system unless the person has consumed large amounts of seafood, which Phil had not.
He said, Mr. Rouse, do you know of anybody that might want you dead? I said, what are you telling me?
Dr. Merigian suspected Phil was being poisoned.
The poisoned cells do not continue to exhibit arsenic in them. Arsenic does the damage, and then it's excreted from the body, or it's sequestered in the bone. So, by any measure, you're not going to be able to identify the actual compound itself, even though the damage is there.
Phil tried to recall anything suspicious about the time he spent with his partner, Steve White. And then he remembered. Every time he and Steve had a meal or a drink together, Phil's health deteriorated.
I noticed that several times we ate together, I'd get sick afterward, the next day or two. And I just kept getting sick. Every time we'd eat together, I'd get sick.
Even more alarming, Steve White was a chemist by training and taught chemistry at the local high school. As a final forensic test, Dr. Merigian gave Phil Rouse very specific instructions.
I told him, don't cut your hair. And then I would be able to clip it and send it to a laboratory for analysis.
When someone is exposed to poison, it goes through the body and is usually excreted. But it also gets deposited in the hair root at the time of exposure. When the hair grows out, the shaft becomes an historic record of when the exposure took place. When Phil's hair grew longer, a strand was sent for an ICP test, which tests for 22 different metal components at the same time.
Hair grows at a pretty regulated rate, and someone could take a shaft of hair, divide it into segments, and determine, what was present a month ago, what was present 2 months ago, depending on that piece placement on the original shaft.
The hair was cut into 1/4-inch pieces, marked, then each piece was placed in a separate vial, mixed with acidified water and boiled for 7 hours. This cocktail was then put through the ICP. The test results were startling. When Phil was in the hospital, his hair showed no exposure to poison. But prior to that, when Phil was living at home, Dr. Merigian found traces of another poison, mercury.
I believed that he was ingesting it. I didn't know who or why it would be delivered to him, but I had no doubt that he was poisoned with heavy metals.
State law requires that police be notified when any poison is found in someone's system. When the Bartlett Police Department learned of the poisoning and the financial dispute between Phil and his partner, they took out a search warrant to search Steve White's home.
I thought that at that time, well, now we have something to look into, and we were going to investigate it as a criminal matter.
In White's backyard, in a storage shed, they found a laboratory.
It kind of looked like a little mini science lab, like a chemistry lab. Makeshift lab, There were several different jars of unusual looking powders, strange looking like burners and things like that you would see in a science lab.
Leona White says the reason her husband had the lab was for their children as a way to interest them in science.
He would do things like mix baking powder and vinegar to make a volcano.
But investigators soon discovered items in the shed that were anything but child's play. In a glass jar labeled baking powder, forensic scientists found traces of mercury and arsenic. The arsenic was a special formulation which won't be identified here except to say it was odorless and tasteless. Detective Bailey confronted White with the lab results.
And he had told me that was crazy, absurd, and ridiculous. He said, there's no way there's arsenic in that. I tell you what, bring it to me and I'll drink every bit of it. A few minutes later, he had said, if I was going to kill this guy, I sure wouldn't use arsenic. I'd do it with something much quicker and legal.
Everything in his statement that he gave to the police, a 21-page rambling statement, was false. And I'm not even sure if Steve White is his real name.
A search of the car restoration office produced an envelope found hidden behind the electrical panel. Analysis of the materials inside revealed arsenic, antimony, mercury, and lead, each a highly toxic metal. A forensic document examiner compared the handwriting on the envelope to known samples of Steve White's and concluded they were both similar. Steve White was arrested and charged with the attempted murder of Phil Rouse. But important questions remained. How did the poisons get into Phil Rouse's body? Forensic toxicology proved Phil Rouse had been poisoned by heavy metals, and similar poisons were found in the home of his business partner, Steve White. But prosecutors didn't have enough evidence to show how Phil Rouse was poisoned.
We were never able to prove conclusively how he got these compounds into Mr. Rouse's system. We were able to prove that he had ample opportunity.
Phil Rouse recalled a number of incidents with Steve White marked by unusual behavior. Prior to his illness, Phil and Steve were having dinner at a local restaurant. Not long after placing their order, White complained about the poor service. He got up and went into the kitchen and came back with Phil's entree, but not his own. There was another incident involving a bottle of wine.
Mr. White made a bottle of wine, brought it to Mr. Rouse, insisting that he drink all of it, and insisting that he get the bottle back, because he wanted to give Mr. Rouse some more.
And White would often visit Phil at home to share a cup of coffee and talk about work. But Phil says Steve would frequently ask Phil to get something from another room, leaving Steve alone with the coffee. Phil and Kimo Coelho both recalled a time when White offered to get them hamburgers for lunch.
After eating these, they both became very ill. And they actually made a joke about how they're never going to send Steve White after food again because it's going to make us sick again.
When confronted with the evidence, Steve White denied any involvement with Phil's illness. His lawyer claimed that the accusations were circumstantial and that there was no proof White was in any way involved. The defense also pointed out that the lab results showed only trace amounts of the various heavy metals in Rouse's body, but never a lethal amount. The prosecution claimed this was intentional, that Mr. White wanted Phil to die slowly after a prolonged illness so there would be no suspicions.
I hate to say ideal, but it actually is the ideal way of trying to harm someone, because if you're not focused or you're not suspicious of it, the physician won't see it.
The fact that there were poisons found, the amount of these poisons that it would take to kill Mr. Rouse was irrelevant. The mere fact that the defendant had arsenic, antimony, lead, mercury at his disposal was the relevant fact.
The prosecution says the motive was money, that Phil Rouse's death would have enabled White to get out of debt. White had over $90,000 in credit card debt, a substantial amount for a public school teacher. The prosecution subpoenaed several waitresses from the Bartlett area, all attractive women with the same story. They said Steve White was a very generous tipper. In one instance, for a $15 check, White tipped the waitress $60.
A $100,000 life insurance policy could pay his way out of debt. If Mr. Rouse had died, he would also had inherited 100% of a small business.
After a week-long trial, the jury found Steve White guilty of first-degree attempted murder, theft, and sales tax violations. He was sentenced to 31 years in prison.
If it hadn't been for the heavy metals test and Dr. Merigian running all the tests on my husband, he would have been dead.
His antique automobile restoration business is now closed. To this day, White maintains his innocence.
These people were our friends for 14 years. I mean, we thought they were our friends. I couldn't believe that he had made that charge against Steve. I know Steve didn't do it.
Phil still has numbness in his extremities and is unable to walk due to nerve damage.
This guy that I know, he was my business partner, he's going to jail. I don't know for how long. I don't know, I may be crippled the rest of my life. I said 2 families are devastated. Who won today? You tell me. Tell me who won here today.
an unemployed gardener with a history of mental illness, was a vital witness in the case of a missing 6-year-old girl.
He's still working on me.
Between songs, he provided details about events which took place more than a decade earlier. Investigators weren't sure the man could be trusted and left it up to forensic science to determine the truth. Memorial Day weekend, 1986. In Silver Spring, Maryland, it was so hot, 6-year-old Michelle Dorr asked her father if she could play in the small pool in their backyard.
She was playing in the backyard pool for a while and showing me how she could blow bubbles in the water and that sort of thing.
Michelle was spending the weekend with her father. Her parents were going through a bitter divorce, and custody arrangements for Michelle, their only child, were still being worked out. Michelle's mother, Dee Dee, wanted full custody of her daughter.
I got an ex parte order saying that I was a threat to Michelle and a threat to her, and I was physically abusive, and she needed court-ordered custody right then.
But those problems were put aside for what Carl believed would be a pleasant weekend with his daughter. After Carl made lunch, he went back outside to check on Michelle, but she wasn't there. So he walked to his neighbor's home, the Clark family, to see if Michelle was there visiting her friend Elizabeth, but they hadn't seen her.
He said, "No, she's not here." And I looked at Elizabeth, and she's not with you. And I couldn't believe what Jeff was saying. And it just didn't register at first, you know, that she couldn't be with Elizabeth. And at that point, I realized that, you know, she's never gone any further than the Clark house, that there's something's wrong.
Carl Dorr immediately contacted police.
She was not a little girl who would roam off indiscriminately. She was not a little girl who would roam off and wander away and take up with strangers.
I mean, the Clark house was 50 feet away, so I never had to worry about her crossing the street or wandering off. If I wanted to find her, I knew where to find her.
When police contacted Michelle's mother, Dee Dee, she told them she knew what had happened to Michelle.
She point blank told them that I did it. I did something with Michelle.
Michelle's mother told the police he had threatened to harm his own daughter. He had threatened, in the heat of anger, in the heat of a very horrible divorce, to take Michelle away so that her mother couldn't have her anymore.
You have to take it in the context that she's a mother who is in this very nasty divorce, separation, custody battle, and also somebody who her daughter has just disappeared. So you have to take it in that context.
Carl Dorr was outraged by his ex-wife's accusation and demanded to be given a polygraph test. He failed.
He's trying to tell me that I didn't pass the polygraph test. That's an impossibility. I didn't have anything to do with Michelle disappearing. Don't tell me I failed the polygraph test. That didn't happen.
Carl Dorr was now the prime suspect, and soon he would tell police of the role he'd played in his daughter's disappearance. In the days after Michelle Dorr's disappearance, missing posters were placed throughout the area, but there was no sign of the little 6-year-old girl. Investigators were convinced her father, Carl, had either kidnapped or killed her. Carl Dorr had failed a polygraph test, and the detective on the case was pressuring him to confess.
He kept insisting, you know, you've done something. I know you've done something with Michelle, and we're going to find her body, and when we find her body, I'm coming to get you, is what he told me, point blank, finger in the face, you know, in my face, screaming, yelling, you know, you need to confess.
Just a few days later, Carl Dorr confessed.
On 3 different occasions, he told the police he'd killed his daughter and told the police where they could go and find her body. And one of them was underneath I guess the crawl space of his house. Another was in his father's own grave in a cemetery in D.C.
Police checked the crawl space of the home and found nothing. They also checked the local cemetery where his father was buried, but nothing was found.
He felt a lot of pressure, and the police put a lot of pressure on him. And as a result of that pressure and the guilt and the shame that he felt about his daughter's disappearance, he cracked. There's no doubt about that. He cracked.
I couldn't deal with what they were telling me, that we're not going to find Michelle alive. I just was trying to go into some sort of denial about that.
He then checked himself into a local hospital. He thought the television was talking to him and that he had the power to find Michelle and bring her back to life.
I was starting to lose it. I mean, in a psychiatric sense. I mean, I was having a nervous breakdown. I was hallucinating. I was seeing things that weren't there. I was hearing people that weren't there.
After 3 days of much-needed rest and sedation, Carl was released from the hospital and told the press that he had never confessed. He said his statements were twisted into an admission of guilt. To prove his point, he asked to take a second polygraph examination. This time, he passed. Investigators now began to wonder, was it possible that someone else had taken Michelle Dorr?
In my experience, in a case where somebody confesses or where the police have the wrong suspect, they seem to try to make all the facts fit around that person. So they're so busy doing that, and they have the tunnel vision that we have the right suspect, this is who it is, that they forget about looking at any other options.
Months went by, and then years, with no sign of Michelle. The investigation came to a dead end. In the minds of police, Carl Dorr remained a suspect, but they had no evidence to charge him. Then, 6 years later, there was a new development.
10 days after 24-year-old Laura Holdling disappeared from her Bethesda home, her family tells reporters they believe they know what happened to her.
In what seemed to be an unrelated case, a Harvard graduate, Laura Holdling, was reported missing. She lived a few miles away from Michelle and Carl Dorr. Laura Holdling had been stabbed to death in her bedroom while asleep. Her killer left behind few clues. He had done an unusually thorough job of cleaning up the crime scene.
Normally, you would have found blood splatter elsewhere in the room or some indications of a fight or something, but that area, that bedroom, the crime scene itself had been cleaned up and cleaned up very good.
But he made one mistake. In Laura Holdling's hairbrush was one foreign hair. It wasn't human. It was from a wig. The Holdling's gardener, 30-year-old Haddon Clark, was a known cross-dresser.
He had mental problems. We also discovered that he was a cross-dresser. He would dress in women's clothing.
The wig hair in Laura Holdling's hairbrush matched a wig found in Haddon Clark's possession. Investigators believe that after killing Laura Holdling, Haddon Clark dressed in women's clothing, put on the wig, and left the scene of the crime in broad daylight without creating any suspicion. Haddon Clark was convicted of Laura Holdling's murder. Then, police made a startling discovery.
The police say to themselves, hey, wait, we've heard this name before. This was a guy that we were looking at who lived in the house where Michelle Dorr was last supposed to have been seen or have gone. And so at that point, they started really pressing Haddon on the Michelle Dorr case and looking at him as a very serious suspect.
Haddon Clark lived just 2 houses away from Michelle Dorr at the time of her disappearance. His niece, Elizabeth, was Michelle's playmate. When Michelle first disappeared, Haddon Clark was questioned about his whereabouts that day. And something unusual happened during his interrogation that should have aroused police suspicions. Haddon Clark confessed to the murder of 23-year-old Laura Hoteling, but he denied having anything to do with the disappearance of Michelle Dorr. But on the day Michelle disappeared, police discovered that Clark was alone in his brother's home, just 2 doors away from Michelle's home. He was packing his things since his brother had kicked him out because of what he called inappropriate behavior with the children.
What happened that day back in 1986 was that Haddon was very angry. His brother's wife, and his children had left the home in order to give Haddon an opportunity to get his things and get out. And they had given him a deadline to get out.
That same day, police questioned Haddon Clark and asked him if he knew anything about Michelle's disappearance.
He was answering questions and was cooperative. When the nature of the interview changed and Michelle Dorr's name was mentioned, Haddon's entire demeanor changed. He began to shake violently. He began to rock back and forth in his chair. He actually became physically sick and had to leave the room at the mere mention of Michelle's name.
Although police knew his behavior was unusual, it was discounted once Carl Dorr allegedly confessed.
There was no evidence to suggest that Haddon Clark had killed Michelle Dorr, other than his own quirky, bizarre behavior, which could be attributed to a number of things, one of which being his own mental illness. So that's why the police stepped away from Haddon Clark and focused on Carl Dorr for months and years after Michelle's disappearance.
How can you not suspect this guy in 1986 if you even, spend an afternoon with him? You don't have to go to Kmart to figure out he's crazy.
Once in prison for Laura Hoteling's murder, Clark refused to answer questions about Michelle Dorr.
I know what's going on. I'm not talking about nothing, because my lawyer told me not to. I told you honestly, I answer some of your questions, whatever you want to ask. But some questions I'm not going to answer. That's just the way it is.
This is Jim Beckett. At one time, he was incarcerated with Haddon Clark in the same prison cell block. He had more luck getting Haddon to talk about his crimes than the police.
I just wanted to find out the truth of it, so I got in real close to him, and I sort of thought there was a window of opportunity to find out the truth through him. Rather than intimidating him, I became a good friend, and I talked to him on many, many occasions.
One day, while Beckett and Clark were in the prison cafeteria, Beckett asked Haddon about Michelle Dorr.
He was saying she was such a lovely young girl and all, and I could see it was bothering him. I looked at him and I said, Haddon, I said, why did you do it? And when I said it like that, he blurted out, he says, I didn't mean to do it. He didn't repeat it, but he says, I didn't mean to do it. And it was like, he knew what was being said. And he knew he had just confessed to me that he had killed her.
Beckett then told police that Clark confessed to killing Michelle Dorr in a small bedroom in his brother's home. But police had no physical or forensic evidence to charge Clark. But then they remembered how expertly Clark cleaned the crime scene after Laura Hoteling's murder.
The police put 2 and 2 together and realized that he had been able to clean and meticulously clean a crime scene where there was a lot of bloodshed. He was able to remove evidence from a crime scene to the point where family members had no idea that a murder had taken place there.
It had been 10 years since Michelle's disappearance, and Haddon Clark's brother had sold the home, and a number of families had occupied it since. Police wondered whether any forensic evidence remained. Haddon Clark's prison roommate told police that Clark admitted killing Michelle Dorr in a bedroom in his brother's home. But 10 years had passed, and the home had been owned by a number of families since. The bedroom was only 7 by 10 feet. It had no rugs or carpet, but it did have the original oak wood floor. Unfortunately, it had been sanded and refinished with polyurethane at least once, possibly more, which might have destroyed any evidence that existed. To find out, police used luminol, a chemical which glows when it comes into contact with the iron component in blood. After spraying the floor, investigators noticed a faint glow along the seams of the oak paneling.
What actually appeared was long luminescence lines along the slats of the floorboards, not on the surface of the floor, but deeply embedded in the actual slats themselves.
The entire floor was taken apart for further tests. Investigators wanted to know if the blood between the floorboards was human, and if it was, whose blood was it? Forensic scientist Susan Ballou used Q-tips to swab the side of each seam of every floorboard. The Q-tips were rinsed with phenolphthalein, then with hydrogen peroxide. Only 2 tiny areas turned purple, a positive presumptive test for blood. Unfortunately, it wasn't a large enough sample for DNA testing.
So then we had to decide what else can be done with this particular blood, these samples that we definitely want to determine where they originated from.
So scientists decided to try a mitochondrial DNA test. Mitochondria exists outside of the cell's nucleus, and they're passed on genetically from a mother to her children. It's not as precise as nuclear DNA testing, but it still can be used for identification.
There's a lot more mitos, as we call them, present in a cell than the one nucleus. So the theory is, because of those mass numbers in each individual cell, you have a better opportunity to get a higher level of the mitoDNA that you might be able to get results with.
The mitochondrial DNA from blood between the floorboards matched the mitochondrial DNA profile of Michelle's mother.
In other words, somebody from their family left blood at that location.
Since Michelle had been inside the home and not her mother, the blood was believed to be Michelle's. Prosecutors believe that after Carl Dorr went inside to make lunch, Michelle left the pool to look for her friend Elizabeth. In a freak, tragic coincidence, when Michelle knocked on Elizabeth's door, no one was home, except Haddon, who was packing his things since his brother had ordered him to move out.
We believe that he saw Michelle. He saw her as an opportunity to vent his rage. We also believe that he saw it as an opportunity to get revenge on his brother.
Police believe Haddon killed Michelle in the upstairs bedroom, then cleaned the blood from the floor. He probably removed Michelle's body in one of the duffel bags neighbors saw him carrying when moving out later that day.
I don't believe he has an ounce of remorse for what he's done to Michelle. And you know, he doesn't even deserve to live as far as I'm concerned. You know, he is completely worthless as a human being. I have nothing to say to him. I don't need his apologies. I don't need anything from him.
Fortunately, the sanding, polyurethane, and 10 years' worth of detergents hadn't destroyed the mitochondrial DNA evidence. Carl Dorr has since remarried and moved on with his life. But he has kept Michelle's letters and this crayon self-portrait she drew just days before she was murdered.
She had just lost one of her front teeth before she disappeared. So, she had a little bit of a gap in her front teeth, but a sweet, innocent little girl.
Haddon Clark was convicted of Michelle Dorr's murder and was sentenced to a second life term in prison. Shortly after his conviction, Haddon Clark directed police to the shallow grave where he had buried Michelle's body. It was just 12 miles from her home.
I believe when Haddon asked the police, or told the police that he would show them where Michelle Dorr's body was, he asked to be able to dress as a woman. The police went and got him women's clothes and a wig.
Haddon Clark now claims his female persona, whom he refers to as Kristen Bluefin, is the real killer.
He dresses as this woman, he writes letters as this woman, he speaks as this woman, and it is the woman that commits the crimes.
Psychologists say that Clark, here apparently unaware of being videotaped before his police interrogation, is a paranoid schizophrenic who cannot control his compulsion to kill.
Now, love your patient he must be. He's still working on me.
Everyone who knows him is convinced he would kill again if given the chance.
He's intelligent. I think he was able to get away with crimes for a long time, and I think that he knows what he's doing. He's good at his job.
He is a definite skilled criminal in making sure that the crime scene is cleaned up. All little loose ends are tied up. However, there's always been some small bit of evidence that we have found to still pinpoint that crime to Haddon Clark.
One summer's evening, a woman left a bar in Anchorage, Alaska, and staggered into the street. She was drunk, she was defenseless, and soon, she was dead. The killer left this unusual clue at the crime scene. It was evidence that could be visualized with a simple tube of glue. August 8, 1996 was a beautiful summer morning in Anchorage, Alaska. But on this day, workers entering a downtown office building saw something different.
It's the first time I've ever experienced anything like this. I never want to experience it again. This is horrible.
It was a body laying near a wooded area.
She'd been beat in the face pretty severely, and she didn't appear to be breathing.
The woman's checked jacket and clothing were strewn over a 30-foot area, a clear indication of a life-and-death struggle.
It was an extended assault. It wasn't, he just hit her in the face once. There were multiple blows to her head and her upper chest area.
She had been so badly beaten, a visual identification would be impossible. She didn't match missing persons reports, and apparently there had been no witnesses.
Anytime you have a witnessless crime, you have difficulties. You don't have anybody telling you where to go, where to look, who to ask, and what to do.
The victim hadn't been moved or touched since she was discovered, and the body had been protected from the sunlight. Because of where the victim was found and the circumstances surrounding her death, Captain Bill Gifford made an unusual decision.
I made the decision that we would go ahead and try to get latent prints off the body.
For the last 6 years, Gifford had been experimenting with a special technique to find hidden fingerprints on human skin. Super glue fuming is usually done with non-porous surfaces like glass or metal.
In the early 80s, a gluing factory in Japan, the employees had noticed that as they were gluing various items together, that the vapors which were materializing from the glue were turning the fingerprints, their actual prints on an item, a whitish color. Subsequently, they brought the information to the attention of the Japanese crime lab, and from that, with various organizational meetings, they passed the information on.
To do it with skin, the following conditions must be in place. No emergency personnel can have handled the body. They would wipe prints off and also leave their own. If the victim is dead for a long period of time, decay will destroy any prints. Any precipitation, even dew, can wash away prints. And the temperature must be right. If it's too hot, the prints will melt. If it's too cold, they'll disintegrate. Gifford ordered technicians to build a tent around the body using plastic tarp and PVC pipe. Inside, Gifford heated a pan of water to increase the humidity in the tent. Using a heat gun, a massive amount of super glue was blown into the airtight container around the body. Gifford's secret technique was to use more super glue than forensic scientists usually recommend.
In this case, probably 300 or 400 times the amount of what we normally use on skin. And this time we got the right amount.
The heated glue attaches itself to the biological oils left by someone's fingers or hands. The glue then hardens on the print and can be photographed. This isn't a technique that can be redone. Fortunately, in this case, it worked. On the victim's left thigh was a fragment of a palm print from the killer's left hand.
We were ecstatic. This was the second latent print off of human skin that had been confirmed. So to finally get one, quite a milestone.
The palm print itself was of excellent condition. I could tell based on the slope of the terrain and the location of the print and injuries that were afflicted to the victim exactly which hand it was, because the individual had steadied themselves by placing their hand on the thigh area while they were conducting whatever injuries they were sustaining to the victim.
Above the body, on some low-hanging branches, police discovered 35 head hairs which did not come from the victim. It appeared the branches became entangled in the assailant's hair during the assault. Police now had the palm print and possibly a hair sample from the killer. All they needed now was to identify the victim and find the suspect. When the body of the victim was taken to the morgue in Anchorage, Alaska, the medical examiner determined that she was an Alaska native between 30 and 40 years old, 5 foot 2 inches tall, and weighing 100 pounds. He found a bite mark on the woman's breast and signs she had been sexually assaulted. There were some bloody boot impressions on the victim's torso, but they weren't clear enough to identify.
In this particular case, the violence didn't indicate whether they would be known to one another, but what it did tell us is that the suspect spent considerable time with the victim, both before and after death.
The toxicology report indicated that the victim had a blood alcohol level of 0.308, over 4 times the legal limit. Anchorage police checked missing persons reports, but found no one resembling their victim. At the crime scene, above the body, in some low-hanging branches, police found human hair. The hairs, presumably the assailants, were analyzed and identified as mongoloid. Mongoloid hairs are from Asian races. Native Americans would be included in this category.
Mongoloid hairs tend to have very dark pigmentation. The hairs almost look black visually, and they tend to be very straight.
The hairs were very long, between 18 and 20 inches, and they were highly unusual.
This is one of the most distinctive hair samples that I've ever seen.
The long hairs had been bleached, and because mongoloid hairs are so dark in color, this type of chemical treatment has a distinct effect.
When they add bleach to it, it pulls some of the pigment out. And if it's incomplete, the hair almost looks orangish.
Police were now looking for a native Alaska male with long black hair down to his waist with an uneven orange tint.
We didn't know who the assailant was. We had no idea what that person was going to do, whether this was going to be a series of crimes. And for the first week or so, we certainly had concerns that we had a person or persons capable of committing such a heinous crime walking around our community without us able to identify who that person was.
Since the victim had a high alcohol content at the time of her death, police canvassed bars in downtown Anchorage, many of which are popular with the native community. Many of the bars have extensive video surveillance systems for liability purposes. This way, bar owners can prove they haven't served anyone who is visibly intoxicated.
Bar owners decide whether they want to have these videotape systems or not, and then they install them their own. So there's no mandate for it. They do this on a voluntary basis.
Police collected the surveillance tapes from every downtown bar that had a video system and looked through the hours of footage. One videotape was from an outside surveillance camera taken on the night of the murder. Fortunately, the picture was relatively clear for a night scene. Why? Even at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, the sun is still shining in Alaska since it's so far north. This is why Alaska is called the land of the midnight sun. On this one tape was a clear image of a woman wearing a checked jacket like the one found at the crime scene. She was walking down the street arm in arm with a man with long black hair.
I would say the video image of the individual was fair. It wasn't real clear, but it was fair enough that we felt comfortable to go out and begin searching for the person. It was enough that we could get an idea of who he might be.
The trick now was to find out the individual's identity. Anchorage police uncovered this video surveillance image thought to be their victim and the killer taken on the night of the murder. The videotape was from a surveillance system at a bar in downtown Anchorage called The Avenue. The bar had 9 tiny video surveillance cameras in operation at all times. Almost every square foot of the bar and the entrance and exit are all covered. The bar owner, John Pattee, says the surveillance is not a luxury, it's a necessity.
Video surveillance gives me another body. It gives you the opportunity to have maybe a couple fewer employees, and yet you can monitor, 7 or 8 different locations within the bar.
When police showed the surveillance picture to John Pattee, he could not identify the man in the image. But he knew the woman. Her name was Martha Hanson.
Everyone called her Marty. She was a regular customer since I've been here. I've known her, but just as a customer. A tiny little girl, never caused a problem.
A background check revealed Martha Hanson was a 48-year-old divorced mother of 6 children and was unemployed.
She was just very trusting, very open with people, and it didn't matter who you were, she'd reach out to you. I think that was probably what the downfall was here.
She'd been gone for 2 days before her children reported her missing, which is why police had not connected her to their victim. Pat T. said that on the night of the murder, Martha Hanson was in his bar and was denied service.
The bartender's first engagement with her, that bartender determined that she was too intoxicated to be in here. So we asked her to leave, and she left.
Martha was inside for less than 5 minutes. Patrons remembered her, but did not remember seeing the man in the surveillance image. It appeared that the man never entered the bar, so there was no clear shot of his face.
The best images, unfortunately, were Martha Hanson and the suspect walking away from the bar, so we have the back of the subject as opposed to the front.
The image showed Martha and the man walking arm in arm, which suggested the two knew one another.
We're canvassing the area, again, going back to the businesses, going back to the retailers, going back to people saying, do you know who this person is?
When police put the photograph in the local newspaper, a concerned citizen called with some information. She said that a week after the murder of Martha Hanson, one of her friends blurted out that he'd killed someone. When she asked him how, he held up his hands, indicating that he'd either hit or strangled his victim, or both.
Her initial instinct was he's just bragging, he's intoxicated, he couldn't do something like this.
The man's name was Evans Lee Curtis, with hair so long it fell almost to his waist. Curtis was unemployed with no prior arrest.
Evans Curtis fit the photo that we received from the videotape to a T.
Curtis had left his pants in this woman's bedroom. They appeared to be similar to those in the surveillance image. When police analyzed those pants, they discovered they were spattered with blood. Evans Lee Curtis was interrogated by police, but he denied any involvement in Martha Hanson's murder.
So having your own rights in mind that you talked about, do you want to talk to us about this?
Police had the surveillance image, the hairs, and the palm print of the killer. The question now was whether the forensic evidence would match Evans Lee Curtis. Evans Lee Curtis said he had nothing to do with the murder of Martha Hanson. He claimed the man in the video image was someone else, that he certainly wasn't the only man in Anchorage with long hair. But his long hair was distinctive. It had the same unusual orange color as the hairs found at the crime scene.
The suspect's hair was also chemically treated, was very long in length, and the chemical treatment was irregular along the length, the same as what I found in the hairs from the scene.
Investigators wanted something more conclusive. They wanted to know if the partial palm print found on Martha Hanson's thigh belonged to Curtis. Police took impressions of his hands, focusing more on his palms than his fingertips. Investigators were looking for the distinctive crease between the index and middle fingers they found on Martha Hanson's thigh. When compared, there was no mistaking it. The print on the body was from Evans Lee Curtis.
That presents him with a serious problem, and that problem is, how does he explain why his palm print is on a dead woman?
The print evidence, while significant, was subject to defense attack. The super glue fuming process was so unusual, investigators were concerned whether it would be allowed as evidence. So they conducted DNA testing of the blood found on Curtis's pants. When the blood on the pants was compared to DNA from Martha Hanson's blood DNA, it was a match.
We have no idea why he left his pants behind, but we're glad he did.
But perhaps the most damning clue was found on the boots Curtis was wearing at the time of his arrest. They were given to forensic analyst Jim Wolfe. In a crevice on the boot sole, created by simple wear and tear, he found what looked to be a small pocket of blood.
What really caught my eye, what was on the victim's body appeared to be a heel impression, was some possible bloodstains on the heel of the boot, actually inside a heel that was, or inside a hole that was worn into the heel.
Wolfe swabbed the area, extracting the blood. The DNA from the shoe was compared to Martha Hansen's DNA. It matched. Prosecutor David Wallace had one of the best cases of his career.
In this case, it was forensically solid. Mr. Curtis would have had a lot of explaining to do how all of these pieces of the puzzle were not him when I had multiple experts going to take the stand and say it was in fact Mr. Curtis that killed Martha Hansen.
Police discovered that Curtis knew Martha Hansen's daughter and had actually met Martha at a dinner party a few weeks before her murder.
She had trusted Evans. She had apparently been an acquaintance with him. He had been invited over to the house a couple of times, and I guess she had actually fed him.
Prosecutors believe that when Martha left the Avenue bar, she just happened to run into Curtis. Recognizing one another, they walked down the street arm in arm, possibly on their way to another night spot. But instead, Curtis took Martha to a secluded area and made a sexual advance. When she rejected him, Curtis attacked her.
No, don't do that.
In the ensuing fight, Curtis caught some of his hair in a tree branch, hair which had a distinct orange bleaching. Curtis got blood on his pants. The most unusual piece of forensic evidence was his partial palm print on Martha's left thigh. And when he stepped on Martha's torso, her blood became embedded in the sole of his boot. Since he left the body under the trees, protected from the sunlight and excessive moisture, the conditions were perfect to preserve the print for hours after she died, providing one final clue in a mosaic of evidence that ultimately identified Evans Lee Curtis.
Not aware of any other case in Alaska where a palm print, fingerprint, or any type of print has been lifted from a deceased person.
When faced with the overwhelming amount of forensic evidence, Evans Lee Curtis decided to plead guilty.
Is a brutal killing. The appearance of the victim's face is shocking.
Evans Lee Curtis was sentenced to 99 years in prison. His conviction, a combination of old-fashioned police work, high-tech forensic science, and a little bit of luck.
The videotape evidence, in conjunction with the palm prints and other evidence at the scene, were just over and above what we could have hoped for.
With what we have in technology, give something a shot. And if that doesn't work, modify it, give something else a shot. But there's untold things out there that will eventually be employed where we will be making identifications that people today would think impossible.
Forensic technology is extremely important in many, many cases, whether it's homicide to simple thefts. Because if you don't have a confession, if you don't have an eyewitness to the crime, you have nothing. So with forensic evidence, we are able to circumstantially piece together a puzzle that may never have been pieced together before.
was a mail-order bride lured to the United States with the promise of a better life. Just a few years after she was married, she disappeared. The clue to this mystery came from an unlikely source. A second forensic look at the suspicious death of another woman 16 years earlier. Emelita Reeves was 26 years old. Her husband, Jack, was a 52-year-old former Army sergeant, now working as a painter. Together, the couple had a 3-year-old son, whom we'll call Theo. Emelita had an interesting past. When Emelita was 18, she had been her family's passport out of poverty. 11 of her family members lived in a 2-room hut in Cebu City in the Philippines.
She was a beauty queen in her community, and she was a lovely girl. She wanted to go to school, but her family had convinced her that that's how they could have a better life if she married a rich American.
At her family's request, Emelita put her picture in Cherry Blossoms, a subscription service for mail-order brides. In 1987, Jack Reeves flew to the Philippines to meet her.
There were 2 other American men that were there to meet her, and he pretty well bulldozed his way into the house, offered her father more money than the other men had offered, and her father chose Jack to be Emelita's husband.
Once Emelita arrived in Texas, Jack Reeves kept his promise and started sending Emelita's family $250 a month, a small fortune compared to the $3 a month Emelita's father was earning. On October 11, 1994, Emelita Reeves went to lunch with some friends at the Lotus Restaurant in Arlington, Texas. During lunch, Emelita confided to her friends that she was no longer in love with her husband. Instead, she was in love with someone else, another woman, and was anxious to start a new life. After lunch, Emelita went shopping, but never returned home. Later, when her friends couldn't get in touch with her, either on her cell phone or her pager, they called police. When questioned, Jack Reeves told police he wasn't particularly concerned about his wife's disappearance. He said his wife may have run off with her female lover.
Jack was into all this pornography, and he was into watching videos of women together, men and women in the act, sexual acts. But he drew the line at Emelita going out with any other men. And if he ever found out that she had close male friends that she went out with, then he became very angry.
And Reeves was convinced his wife would return.
Matter of fact, he was very nonchalant, telling the officers that she would return as she always does.
Police located Emelita's lover, Mona Lisa Pate.
Mona Lisa Pate admitted to us that she and Emelita were in fact engaged in a relationship.
She also admitted she was with Emelita until 8 p.m. on the night of her disappearance, but she didn't know where Emelita went afterwards. 2 days later, Emelita's abandoned car was found in a supermarket parking lot just a few miles from her home. Police interviewed her husband once again.
Initially, he said she had just run off, but then he decided he was going to start helping. So he brings in to Tom Lenore's office something that he believes will help track Emelita.
Even with Emelita's scent, search dogs were unsuccessful. In another attempt to help the investigation, Jack Reeves offered a $25,000 reward for information leading to his wife's safe return. But police got their first break in the case when a detailed search of Emelita's abandoned vehicle gave investigators some important insight into her last ride. Police in Texas were starting to believe that there was foul play involved in Emelita Reeves' disappearance. When police inspected Emelita's abandoned car, they noticed something suspicious.
When the vehicle was found, the seat was consistent with someone much taller than Emelita, who was a very short person. The steering wheel was not locked, as Emelita always locked it, and the alarm was not set on the vehicle, which Emelita always did.
and suspicions mounted when police learned that none of Emelita's clothing was missing from her home. They also learned that Emelita was not in love with her husband. Emelita also told friends Jack once asked her to have sex with one of his sons from an earlier marriage. Emelita refused. Police asked Jack Reeves to come to police headquarters to retrieve Emelita's car. Jack had apparently left town. He had taken his young son and left for nearby Lake Whitney, where he frequently camped. And police also learned that Jack Reeves had recently offered Emelita a substantial sum of money, $30,000, if she agreed not to leave him.
In speaking with Emelita's friends, they reflected several conversations that Emelita had had with them where she expressed a tremendous fear that Jack would in fact kill her, in her words, as he had killed his other wives.
Jack Reeves had been married 3 other times, and his second and third wives both died under mysterious circumstances. Jack married his first wife, Amaryllis, when she was only 15 years old. Her mother later had the marriage annulled. In 1961, Jack married his second wife, Sharon. Together, the couple had 2 sons. While Jack was in South Korea with the U.S. Army, Sharon filed for divorce. Reeves immediately flew home to try to save the marriage. A few days later, Sharon died from a shotgun wound to her chest. Her death had been ruled a suicide. After Sharon's death, Jack returned to Korea, where he met wife number 3, Myung-Hoi Chung. 6 years later, while vacationing at Lake Whitney, Myung was on a raft in the lake while Jack was away gathering fish bait.
And when he came back, he claims that that's when he found Myung had fallen off of the raft and had drowned. Her sister attended the funeral and found bruises on her arms and scrapes. She contended from the very beginning, when she learned of Myung's death, that Jack had killed her.
I talked to the sister and I said, what is this about Myung? You know, we're all kind of wondering about it. And she said, well, I wondered not only because of the nails, but because of the scratches on Jack's hands. And I thought, well, like he was scratched up by brush when he pulled her out of the water. And she said, no, long parallel scratches on his hands. And it made me think, you know, were those from her fingernails?
After the funeral, Jack had Myung's body cremated. Despite her family's concerns, there was no investigation. After learning of Jack's past, Detective Lenore was convinced Emelita Reeves had been the victim of foul play and set a trap to test his hypothesis. He spoke once again to Jack Reeves, and this time bragged about the latest advances in DNA testing.
I went into this dissertation, which was completely fictitious and made up on the spot, about when an individual dies, cells on the body immediately die. DNA falls from the body, and in fact would fall and embed itself into his carpet, to where you can shampoo it, vacuum it, do whatever you want. You're not going to get rid of it. The only thing you have to do is get rid of the carpet.
The next day, as undercover police watched from across the street, Jack Reeves did just that. He replaced the carpet in his home. He had taken the bait.
There was absolutely no reason for him to take that particular activity at that particular time.
But police still had no forensic evidence against Jack Reeves, and they still could not find Emelita. Arlington Police Detective Tom Lenore believed his best chance of solving the disappearance of Emelita Reeves was to investigate the sudden and unusual circumstances surrounding the deaths of Jack's other wives. Jack's third wife, Myung Reeves, had drowned in 10 feet of water in Lake Whitney after falling off a raft. At the time of the accident, The local game warden reported that Myung's raft was undamaged and had a full air supply. He thought it was unlikely that an adult could fall off and not be able to retrieve it. And the drowning occurred in 10 feet of water. If Myung indeed slipped off her raft, investigators couldn't understand why she was unable to swim just a short distance to where she could have stood in the lake. Unfortunately, there had been no criminal investigation and no autopsy was performed. Myung Reeves had been cremated. Jack's second wife, Sharon Reeves, was found dead in her bedroom from what was believed to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound to her chest. Since it was presumed to be suicide, there had been no autopsy performed. And only one photograph of the accident scene remained. Arlington police sent the photograph to the internationally known blood spatter expert Tom Bevel. At the time of the accident, Jack told police that he believed Sharon was sitting on the bed and pushed the trigger with her toe. But an analysis of the blood spatter evidence revealed that Sharon had been standing at the time the gun went off. Blood on Sharon's thigh was in an L-shaped pattern, indicating that Sharon was standing when blood first dripped down her thigh from the wound. Then, after she fell backwards, the blood changed direction.
Had Sharon Reeves been sitting, the blood spatter as well as the blood flows would have looked entirely different. In fact, it would have been a reverse.
And with Sharon in a standing position, she would have been physically unable to discharge the gun.
I would say that it's not absolutely impossible, but highly improbable that that would be the case.
Detective Lenore now had probable cause to exhume the body of Sharon Reeves, 16 years after her death. The autopsy was conducted by Dallas County Medical Examiner Dr. Jeffrey Barnard.
She had a shotgun wound of the chest, and the entrance wound was in the front of the chest and had a very sharp right to left trajectory. So the shotgun entrance was really in the front, but very sharply went to the left lateral chest.
And the angle of the shot was slightly downward.
With that very acute trajectory, with her being in an upright position, how she would have to hold the weapon would prevent her from the ability to reach the trigger and to discharge it herself, which makes it not possible for her to have done.
With a trajectory that was a very sharp trajectory, ending up with her shot dead on the bed and then the shotgun standing perfectly vertical between her legs, just made that a very unlikely scenario.
I had no doubt whatsoever that this was not the case of a self-inflicted gunshot wound.
Sharon Reeves' death was officially ruled undetermined, suggestive of a homicide. Jack Reeves was in the house when the shooting occurred.
There was nobody else in the house at the time, so that made it by process of elimination. If Sharon didn't pull the trigger, Jack had to.
According to Patricia Springer's book, Mail Order Murder, after Emelita's disappearance, Jack Reeves was desperate for female companionship. So desperate, he called Emelita's 21-year-old sister, asking her to come live with him. When that failed, Jack renewed his subscription to Cherry Blossoms magazine and through the personal ads found wife number 5, Emelia, who was also in the Philippines. But before the two could meet, Jack Reeves was arrested.
We picked him up, put him in the car, handcuffed and all. Jack looks at Ranger Cummings and said, you know, what's the deal? What's going on here? And Fred said, you're under arrest for murdering your wife. And Jack said, which one? And we all just kind of looked at each other and said, well, that's probably a fair question.
Five months after the disappearance of Emelita Reeves, her husband Jack was arrested for murder.
When he was arrested, he repeatedly told me that he had not killed Emelita and that he should not be arrested. And that's when I explained to him that he was being arrested for the murder of Sharon Reeves. And the look on his face, and the shock, and the complete and total devastation that it took on him was very remarkable.
Sharon was Jack's second wife, who died of a gunshot wound 16 years earlier.
Mr. Reeves, any comment? I'm not guilty.
Police had tried to build a case against Reeves for the murder of his fourth wife, Emelita, but they lacked evidence. In the trial of Sharon Reeves' death, the case hinged on blood spatter evidence and a shooting reenactment. The reconstruction of the shotgun blast challenged Jack's story that Sharon was sitting on the bed and pushed the trigger with her toe. The female police officer assisting in the recreation could not maneuver her toe into the trigger guard of the gun.
The jury was really entranced by that. They were into it, and they had to be, because this was a case where, first of all, we had to show she couldn't have pulled the trigger. Second of all, we had to show that there was nobody else available to pull the trigger except for Jack, and that by process of elimination, he had to have been the one that committed the murder.
Jack Reeves was found guilty of Sharon's murder and was sentenced to 35 years in prison. On October 1st, 1995, nearly 1 year to the date of her disappearance, deer hunters at Lake Whitney stumbled upon a shallow grave. The remains were sent to the medical examiner's office in Fort Worth, Texas. Deputy Chief Medical Examiner Mark Krause was able to identify the remains by comparing Emelita's dental records to the recovered jaw. It was a match. Emelita was found without clothing, jewelry, or personal items, which was not consistent with someone who ran away. Dr. Krause hoped that the bones would tell how Emelita was killed. But there was no bone trauma, no bullet holes, no knife wounds, and unfortunately, the hyoid bone was missing.
If it's fractured, and if it's fractured in a certain way, we can assume that a strangulation has occurred, that the person has been strangled to the point that that bone was damaged and it was likely to be fatal.
But Dr. Krause made an important discovery. In the soil around Emelita's lungs were tiny single-celled organisms called diatoms. This was an important finding. Why? Diatoms live in water.
By finding a relatively high density of these little microscopic creatures, skeletons, in the area where the lungs had once resided when the body was placed in the grave, and by finding very low concentrations or low numbers of diatoms elsewhere, the inference could be made that she was drowned, that she had inhaled water containing diatoms, and when her body decomposed, this material was deposited in the grave. I'm more certain than not that she was drowned in a homicidal manner, that she was killed by drowning.
Later, police visited Lake Whitney with the Reeves' young son, Theo, who told police to watch out for the big hole as he pointed in the direction of his mother's grave. He also said his mother was hurt in the bathtub by his father.
There was a likelihood, quite frankly, a probability, that Jack actually had his son with him at the time Emelita was buried. The child made a remarkable comment that illustrated he was familiar with that particular geography. He was able to actually pinpoint specific areas where Emelita was buried that supported our suspicion that he actually watched and saw his mother get buried.
Jack Reeves stood trial again, this time for Emelita's murder.
You didn't kill Emelita?
No, I did not.
He was convicted of her murder as well.
When he heard the D word, meaning divorce, from any of his wives, he considered it to be death, and he killed them.
Jack Reeves was sentenced to 99 years in prison. He will not be eligible for parole until the age of 106.
He's a sociopath. He has absolutely no remorse for what he's done. He wants to manipulate you into trying to believe that he's innocent and then help him prove it. Jack Reeves probably has absolutely no redeeming quality about him.
Jack Reeves is definitely where he deserves to be, and that's in prison for the remainder of his life.
The forensics made the case. Without them, nothing would have happened in either case. There would have been no identification, there would have been no means of death, there would have been no conviction.